G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. Today we'll be looking at the book of Micah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session of Micah. We're looking at chapter 1, verse 10 to chapter 3, verse 8. Quick recap on who Micah is. Micah means who is like God. We know nothing about him other than that he's from a small town called Moresheth-Gath, which is in the lowlands, in the Shephelah, in the lowlands down there. He prophesied against Judah around about 739 to 702 BC. He is a contemporary of Isaiah, who Isaiah was the city prophet, if you like, in Jerusalem. Major points of Micah's book is that God's going to punish both Israel and Judah for their sins. And he rails against the Jewish leaders because they're responsible for leading the nation astray. And he also talks about the survival of the remnant. And again, one of his major points is that Israel's redemption will come by way of the Messiah. His theme is wrath upon Jerusalem or Judah, Jerusalem, and Samaria, Israel. The judgment upon Israel, it comes forth because in the immediate period, the coming of the Assyrian invasions on the Shalmaneser and Sennacherib. So that's not far off track with Micah. And then the complete fulfillment would be at the second coming. And God's going to use Gentile nations to punish Israel. What for or why? Because Samaria was guilty of idol worship, and that will be what will result in their destruction. Judah, the southern kingdom, doesn't escape judgment, for she has corrupted Jehovah worship. She still worships Jehovah, but she does it in her own way. What did they do? They built these little altars in the high places or hills all over the land of Judah, and they worshiped Jehovah God through these things. And this is where they sacrificed and these. And all of that was totally unacceptable to God, because the only place you could sacrifice was in Jerusalem. Couldn't sacrifice outside of Jerusalem. And Judah's corruption is centered in the capital, in Jerusalem. And Micah sees a specific judgment against Judah, the southern kingdom. And she's going to suffer the judgment of invasion. And the immediate invasion was the Assyrian invasion, where Assyria destroys 47 of their cities, but didn't take Jerusalem. Jerusalem was never captured by the Assyrians. But again, these things took place because of her sin, the sin of Judah. So we're going to continue on from that, and we're continuing on from chapter 1, verse 10, which is where we start this week. Okay, so we're going to see that we're still in that section where we see the results on Judah, and we see the destruction of the Judean cities in chapter 1, verses 10 to 15. Now, all of these cities that in Judah that he mentions are in a specific section of the country. There's a small section of the country called the Shephelah, and it's in most English translations, you'll see it just called the lowlands, because it's pretty flat. The hill country is high, about 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. But this area of the lowlands, low rolling hill country, averages about 1,500 feet. What's that, about 400 something meters above sea level. It's lots of small farming towns in that area. Most northern town, I think, is a place called Modim, and down the southern area is Lachish. Now, every one of the towns we're going to see in these verses here comes from this area, the Shephelah, the lowlands. This was Micah's area, because he is from one of these towns called Moresheth-Gath, same region that he's going to talk about here. So he's dealing with the destruction of all the towns which are near him. He probably walked through all these towns as he grew up. He's very familiar with the countryside because he's a prophet from this area, the Shephelah. So we see here, he says in verses 10 to 15, he says, "Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. At Beth-le-Ephrath have I rolled myself in the dust? Pass away, O inhabitant of Shephir, in nakedness and shame. The inhabitant of Zoonon is not come forth. The wailing of Beth-ezel shall take from you the stay thereof. For the inhabitant of Marath waiteth anxiously for good, because evil is come down from Jehovah unto the gate of Jerusalem. Bind the chariot to the swift steed, O inhabitant of Lachish. She was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion, for the transgressions of Israel were found in thee. Verse 14, therefore shalt thou give a parting gift to Moresheth Gath. The houses of Achzib shall be a deceitful thing unto the kings of Israel. I'll yet bring unto thee, O inhabitant of Mareshah, him that shall possess thee. The glory of Israel shall come even unto Adullam. So what Micah does here, he uses a play on words here. He uses a form called paronomasia. Paronomasia, meaning it's a play upon words. For instance, I live in Geelong. Geelong means land or cliffs. So he would say Geelong has no land or cliffs. So what Micah does is he takes the name of a town and then he plays a word game with it. We know, for instance, that Philadelphia means brotherly love. And to do what Micah does, he would say Philadelphia has no brotherly love. And you know, someone who knows that Philadelphia means brotherly love will know that he's playing a game with the name. And that's what he does here in these verses. So these are actual cities he's talking about, but they help to spell out Micah's grief. Because remember, we saw in the previous session that Micah went naked for a while because he was so grief-stricken about what was going to happen to his area. So the first one we see is Gath. Hebrew means to tell. So he says, tell it not in Gath. Tell it not in Tell Town. That's basically what the Hebrew would say. Tell it not in Tell Town. So that was a proverbial statement which we can find in 2 Samuel 1 verse 20. So the point here that Micah is making is, don't let Israel's enemy, Gath of the Philistines, know the severity of the situation. That's basically what he's saying here. Second name was Beth-le-Ephrath, house of dust. Roll in the dust of dust city. So that's what he's saying. The house of dust will roll in the dust. And what he's doing here, he's implying a funeral or a humiliating defeat. The third one is Shephir, means beautiful or fair. So what he says is beauty town will become unbeautified. People will become prisoners of war, totally stripped of their fine clothing. So that's their fate. Then we have Zoonon, means to go forth. Go forth, town will not go forth to defend anything. So this is his plain words. It will not go forth to fight the enemy, but will stay besieged inside its walls. And then we had Beth-ezel, which means neighbor town. Neighborly standing will be taken away from neighbor town. It will have too many losses of its own to be of help to its neighbors. Then we have Maroth, which means bitterness. Bitterness comes to bitter town. So the bitterness comes from both God and man. And then we have Lachish, which means swift steed. So it's harnessed a horse in horse town. So instead of God, they put their trust in their military. So this was the first, this Lachish was the first of the Shephelah cities to fall into idolatry. And she began to worship the transgressions of Israel, which was the worship of other gods. So that's the names of the towns around where Micah came from, and these he's showing what's going to happen to them. And remember, these towns are going to be destroyed by the Assyrians. Moresheth Gath means gift or inheritance. So inheritance town will become the inheritance of the enemy. This is Micah's hometown. And this contains the idea of betrothed. So she's betrothed to one, but will become the property of another. Then Achzib means deception or deceit. So deceit town will become deceptive. It will fail to stop the Assyrian invasion. Mareshah means inheritance, pretty much the same as Moresheth Gath. So the enemy inheritor will come and inherit inheritance city. So this is all his play on words for these towns. They're going to inherit it by right of conquest. Adullam, which is a place of David's refuge. So what we see there is that the glory of idolatry will seek refuge in refuge town. And what's going to happen is they're going to be driven into exile. So these are the word games that Micah plays with the meaning of the cities, all of which are cities he's familiar with from his own immediate territory. In verse 16, we see the mourning of Israel. In verse 16 of chapter 1, make thee bald and cut off thy hair for the children of thy delight. Enlarge thy baldness as the eagle, for they are gone into captivity from thee. Now, the initial fulfillment of verse 16 did come with the Assyrian invasion, although ultimately it came later with the Babylonian captivity. And the fulfillment of the prophecies of Micah for Samaria, which is the northern kingdom, we find in 2 Kings 18, verses 9 to 12. And in 2 Kings 18, verses 9 to 11, gives a description of the destruction, and then verse 12 gives the reasons. And the fulfillment of these prophecies are actually in conjunction with Judah, recorded in 2 Kings 18, verses 13 to 16, and also Isaiah chapter 36, verse 1. Remember, the Assyrian army did come to the gate of Jerusalem, but they failed to take it. And the fulfillment of that you can find in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 35 to 37, and also Isaiah 37, verses 33 to 38. Remember, Isaiah is a contemporary here of Micah. Now, what are the causes requiring judgment? We find these in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. We're going to see here why the judgments of chapter 1, verses 2 to 16 are going to take place. First up, we look at verses 1 to 5, where we see the sin and judgment of covetousness. We'll just read the verses as we go along with the PowerPoints. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. Now, verses 1 to 5, what he deals with is with the sin and judgment of covetousness, with the sin itself being described in verses 1 and 2. In verse 1, he pronounces a woe against the wealthy class, the rich people, the rich class, because being in that wealthy class, they actually have the power to do evil, and they've chosen to do so. It says they devise. So they sit down, they get around in a meeting, and they devise, they sit down and they devise and they carefully deliberate what they should carry out next. They planned it all out. All of their evil, all of their sin is a result of careful deliberation, and it's not, just by an impulse. Oh, we think we'll just do that. No. They planned it all out. They sat down and worked it all out, what they're going to do. And they work out how to do it. Then they practice it by doing it, and they get away with it, because in verse 1, it says, they have the power in their hand. They were powerful enough to get away with. They have the authority to carry these things out, and they do so, and they work on the principle that might makes right. If we got the big stick, we're right. And because of their position, they actually get away with it. And in verse 2, and they covet fields and seize them, and houses, and take them away. And they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. So in verse 2, the key content of that sin again is covetousness. And the covetousness here is that they take away the inheritance of others. Micah's contemporary Isaiah, he actually railed against this very same sin in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8. So it's a common sin in Israel and in Judah, because what Micah says about it in the country, Isaiah talked about it in the city. Now, remember that while under Mosaic law, a family inheritance was protected, so that even if they lost it because of indebtedness, they had to receive it back in the year of Jubilee. Now, the way these things were working out now, there was no chance of the family receiving back its inheritance when the Jubilee came. Because of the sin in verses 1 and 2, the judgment now comes in verses 3, 4, and 5. In verse 3, therefore, thus says Jehovah, behold, against this family do I devise an evil, from which you shall not remove your necks, neither shall you walk haughtily, for it is an evil time. Now, in verse 3, he points out that there's going to be evil for evil. In verse 3, it says, God is also devising evil. Now, the Hebrew, just by the way, the Hebrew word for evil has two basic meanings. Sometimes it has the meaning of sin, and sometimes it has the meaning of calamity. Micah likes these parallel word games, as we saw back in chapter 1, when he used paronomasia to describe what's going to happen in these cities by playing games with the meanings of the names of the cities. Now, he says here that while they're devising evil in the sense of sin, God is also devising evil in the sense of calamity. And God is devising calamity in two key areas: because of their false confidence and because of their false pride. Therefore, they're going to be faced with a time of calamity, an evil time. In verse 4, in that day shall they take up a parable against you and lament with a doleful lamentation and say, we are utterly ruined. He changes the portion of my people. How does he remove it from me? To the rebellious he divideth our fields. Now, so when that day comes in verse 4, they'll suffer derision by the enemy. He mentions in that day that a parable will be taken up and they will lament with a doleful lamentation. The Hebrew literally reads that they will lament with a lamentation of lamentations. So they're lamenting. But the point of verse 4 here is that they're going to be mocked. And when they say something in all seriousness, the very same words will come back to them by the mockers, but actually in mocking tones. And we find this in children. One child takes away the toy from another, and then the first child cries, he took away my toy. And the other child mocks him and says, he took away my toy. That's what Micah is doing here. That's the point he's trying to make here in verse 4. The mockers will use the very same wording, but in a mocking tone. And what they're going to be lamenting about is their ruin. They're going to lament over the losses that they've suffered. They're not lamenting for their sin. They're lamenting for losses which came because of their sin. They're not fussed about the sin, it's about the losses. And in verse 5, therefore thou shalt have none that shall cast a line by lot in the assembly of Jehovah. So what we see here is that they're going to lose their family inheritance. He says there'll be none to measure out the land. That's cast a line. Using a lot to measure out the land and to divide the land was the way it was decided how the land would be allotted. We see Joshua in Joshua chapter 18, verses 8 to 10. He did that to decide what tribe would get what portion of the land. And when a father chose how to decide how his property would be divided among his sons, he'd often do it by means of casting out the line. You can find the same thing in Psalm 16, verses 5 and 6. So the next time the land is going to be divided, it won't be divided amongst inheritors of the family. Instead, the enemy will inherit it. So as far as the family is concerned, there'll be none that will cast a line by lot. Only the enemies who take it over will inherit. And notice what he calls Israel's unbelief. He says, therefore, thou shalt have none that shall cast a line by lot in the assembly of Jehovah. Now, although this judgment is coming because of Israel's sin, as far as God is concerned, Israel is still his people. And this is the assembly of Jehovah. But for that very reason, because they are God's congregation, God's assembly, when judgment comes, it's going to be much more severe for Israel than it will be for all the others. Again, what we have here, the principle which we see in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1 and 2, and that is that Israel always receives double for her sins. Why? Because Israel is a covenant nation of God. God put his blessings upon Israel, therefore she should be far more responsible than any other nation. So we've just seen the judgments. Now we see the judgments on the false prophets, and this is in verses 6 to 11 of chapter 2. And this is the second reason why judgment is coming. It's because of these false prophets. And in verse 6, prophesy ye not, thus they prophesy. They shall not prophesy to these, reproaches shall not depart. Now, the sin itself we see in verses 6 to 9. And the sin specifically is the rejection of Micah's message. And what is happening in the first few verses here is that Micah is actually carrying out a dialogue. He's talking to himself. He'll do so again in chapters 6 and 7. But here is a short segment of a dialogue where Micah is actually attacked by his audience. First attack in verse 6 is when he is told, prophesy ye not, thus they prophesy. So the first attack has for its point, don't prophesy this way. So this is not talking to himself. This is he got a dialogue going on here. Don't prophesy this way. Don't be so negative. That's what they're telling him. The point they're making is that if Micah was a true prophet, he wouldn't say such nasty things about what's going to happen to the nation. He wouldn't say it. It was often the case that the audience, the Jewish audience, would deface a true prophet, right? A true prophet, by insisting a true prophet, he wouldn't prophesy negative things. A true prophet only prophesies good things. Now, if you remember back in Amos, we saw this with Amos, chapter 2, verse 12, and chapter 7, verse 16. Where they told Amos to go back down south. Don't come up here with that, go back down south. And then another example you can find in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 10 about Isaiah. Now Micah is told to quit prophesying in this manner. And in the second part of verse 6, Micah's response is, yes, you're right, true prophets will indeed someday stop prophesying this way, but the fulfillment of what they said will come anyway. In other words, if he stops prophesying, it won't mean a cancellation of his negative prophecies. They're still going to happen. Those negative prophecies will still come to pass, whether he mouths them or whether he keeps quiet. They're going to happen anyway. And in verse 7, shall it be said, O house of Jacob, is the spirit of Jehovah straitened? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him that walketh uprightly? So the first part of verse 7 is the second attack from the audience, and it's an attack with a rhetorical question that is raised by the house of Jacob. And the point of the second attack against Micah is, has the Holy Spirit really lost his patience with us? Would he really do such a thing as you say? Surely we wouldn't do these bad things against us. So here, what we have here is the age-old appeal to the goodness of God and the love of God, while totally ignoring the justice and righteousness of God. God is a God of love, everybody says. He wouldn't do that. And this is like those who emphasize one attribute of God and forget all the others that they don't like. So the second response we see in the second part of verse 7 down to verse 9, and Micah points out, yes, God is good and he does good things, but he does good things to the righteous, not the unrighteous. And in verses 8 and 9, Israel has become God's enemy in two ways. But of late, my people is risen up as an enemy. You strip the robe from off the garment from them that pass by securely as men averse from war. Verse 9, the women of my people you cast out from their pleasant houses. From their young children you take away my glory forever. So in verse 8, we see here that they've become God's enemy, first of all, in verse 8, by oppressing the stranger. This is a violation of Mosaic law in Exodus 22, verses 25 to 27. And they take away, what do? They take away the outer garment, which is the only thing that keeps the poor man and the stranger warm. And the second thing is, in verse 9, is that they're guilty of oppressing the widow and the orphan. And again, this too, Micah's contemporary Isaiah railed against them as well in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 2. Again, a violation of Mosaic law. And in verse 10, arise ye and depart, for this is not your resting place, because of uncleanness that destroyeth, even with a grievous destruction. So in verse 10 will come the judgment because Israel has become God's enemy. The judgment will be one of exile. Arise ye and depart, for this is not your resting place. They're going to lose the privilege of living in the land. And as we pointed out in conjunction with the Palestinian or the land covenant, while the ownership of the land is always Israel's because it's based upon the unconditional Abrahamic covenant, the enjoyment of the land will be conditioned on obedience to God. Now, the purpose God gave the land to Israel was to give them rest. That's why he gave the land to them. This is the point of Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 9 to 10. Deuteronomy 12, 9 to 10, and Psalm 95, verses 8 to 11. However, because of their pollutions, the land has become uncleanness, and because of the uncleanness of the land which was caused by them, the land will now spit them out. It'll vomit them out. And this was predicted by Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 to 30, and Leviticus chapter 20, verses 22 to 26. So they are now going to be moved out of the land and no longer have the land as a place of rest or their resting place. And this is all in keeping with the Palestinian covenant in Deuteronomy 29 and 30, which promise that if they obey, they will have rest in the land, but disobedience will bring on exile and dispersion, which is exactly what happened. And verse 11, if a man walking in a spirit of falsehood do lie, saying, I will prophesy unto thee of wine and of strong drink, he shall even be the prophet of this people. So in verse 11, what he does here is that he again gives the reason for this kind of a judgment, and that is their desire for false prophets. We only want prophets who speak nicely to us. They're looking for prophets that will prophesy to them what they want to hear. And the same point is made by Jeremiah chapter 5, verses 30 to 31. Jeremiah 5, 30 to 31. So the prophet says, I will prophesy to you of good things. I'll prophesy that you'll have abundance of wine and strong drink. If that was the case, he'd be immediately elected as the people's prophet. Well, a man like Micah, who is prophesying exactly what God is telling him to prophesy, he's being rejected. We only want to hear nice prophets. We don't want to hear the bad things. Don't preach about sin. Just tell us about how we can become wealthy. Now, what's the application? To carry this a little bit further as the prophets develop it, the Assyrian exile for Israel and the Babylonian exile for Judah was caused because of disobedience to divine revelation. Disobedience to the message of the prophets. For Judah, her disobedience to the prophets brought about the Babylonian exile according to 2 Chronicles 36, verses 11 to 21. According to that 2 Chronicles passage, 2 Chronicles 36, The cause of the Babylonian exile was disobedience to revelation. And in their case, it was the law of Moses. So they had to go into Babylonian captivity until 70 years were up. But not only is the exile a judgment due to disobedience to revelation, so is the worldwide dispersion that came in 70 AD. Dispersion on a worldwide basis was predicted in many places in the New Testament, specifically in Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39. Now, the specific reason for the dispersion was the same. It was disobedience to divine revelation. But this time, that revelation comes by the Messiah. And just as the exile was on till 70 years had passed, that's under Moses, the present dispersion was until the remnant returns to God. Now, until the remnant turns and accepts the Messiah in the manner we saw in Hosea chapter 5, verses 15 to chapter 6, verse 3. Until that happens, the dispersion will continue. It is at this point that his first prophecy concludes with a discussion on the remnant of Israel. And that's what we're going to see in verses 12 and 13 of chapter 2. I will surely, this is 2 verses 12 to 13. I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of thee. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I'll put them together as the sheep of Bozrah. As a flock in the midst of their pasture, they shall make great noise by reason of the multitude of men. The breaker has gone up before them. They have broken forth and passed on to the gate and are gone out thereat. And their king is passed on before them and Jehovah at the head of them. In verse 12, he deals with the city of refuge. There's some confusion in certain prophecy books concerning how much of Israel is actually going to be saved in the last days. Because on one hand, there are prophecies that talk about only the remnant returning, as we see in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 21. And yet other prophecies like the book of Romans, in Romans 11, talk about all Israel coming to God. Now, it's not a contradiction because both statements are true. According to Zechariah chapter 13, verses 8 to 9, as a result of the persecutions against the Jews in the tribulation, by the time we come toward the end of the tribulation, 2/3 of the Jewish population that was living at the start of the tribulation will not survive it. They'll die in the persecutions, but there's 1/3 still left. And that is the 1/3 that will be saved in the last 3 days of the tribulation, as we saw back in Hosea. So what's the connection between the remnant and all Israel? Here he tells you in verse 12, and notice he's using Hebrew poetry here where the lines are parallel. In line 1, he says, I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of thee. And in line 2, I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. So in this verse, all Israel and the remnant of Israel are one and the same, because when the whole nation turns to the Lord, the 1/3 of the nation which is still living at the close of the tribulation, when they all turn to the Lord, then the remnant of Israel and all Israel are then one and the same. And the reason they survive is because the bulk of the remnant with the leaders are able to hide in this specific city. Now, elsewhere in the Bible clearly points out that when the persecutions begin in earnest, the Jews are going to flee Israel. They're going to flee the land. In Matthew 24, verses 15 to 22, is one of those places where it tells that in the middle of the tribulation, the state of Israel will collapse and the Jews will have to flee the land. It doesn't say where they flee specifically. It only gives a clue in Matthew 24, verse 16, where it says that they flee to the mountains, but it doesn't say where in the mountains they flee to. It just says they flee to the mountains. A second passage that deals with Israel's flight is Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 and verses 13 to 17. There also we have no specific place named. It simply says that they flee to the wilderness, to a place that has been prepared for them in advance. The biblical descriptions that we have of where the city of refuge is first of all in the mountains in Matthew 24 and in the wilderness in Revelation 12. Now, Daniel chapter 11, verse 41 points out that the city of refuge is also in the Transjordanian side, which is the other side of the Jordan, the eastern side of the Jordan. And then Isaiah 33, verse 16 also adds that the city is comprised of rocks, a rocky place that is very easily defensible and where food and water will be supplied for them by God. But all these other passages where they talk about where Israel finds refuge, and they never ever name the place. But verse 12 of Micah 2 says, I will put them together as the sheep of Bozrah, as a flock in the midst of their pasture. They shall make great noise by reason of the multitude of them. Now, if you have a New American Standard or an NIV Bible, that name Bozrah is missing, because they did what they often do in other places. They transliterated the name of the place. They chose to translate the name. But what he does here in verse 12 is, again, it's paronomasia, playing words, what he did back in chapter 1, 8 to 16, where he plays upon the meaning of the cities, but he's referring to actual cities. If you have a New American Standard Version or NIV, you'll have the word sheepfold. In the American Standard Version 1901, it's spelled out in Hebrew, it's Bozrah, B-O-Z-R-A. In the King James or All American Version, it's Bozrah. So Bozrah is a specific city where all Israel and the remnant of Israel will be hiding during the persecution of the tribulation. And this city is better known today by its Greek name, which is Petra. Petra. Now, Bozrah means sheepfold. So the remnant, the sheep of Israel, will come to the fold at Sheepfold Town. There they will gather the sheep of Bozrah. And the word as refers not only to sheep, but to the place as well. They'll gather as the sheep of Bozrah. And here again, you have that paronomasia. They'll be gathered together as the sheep of the Bozrah, as the flock in the midst of their pasture. He does here what he did in chapter 1, again, the plain words. And because there are going to be so many Jews in hiding in this city, it says they'll make a great noise by reason of the multitude of men. The Hebrew word means they're going to hum with men. There's going to be a buzz. Because there's such a great number of them, there'll be this constant buzzing sound because of people's conversation. That's going to be the city of refuge for the Jewish people, and those who do survive will actually survive because they are in this city. Now, according to Jeremiah 49, verses 13 to 14, after the Antichrist takes Jerusalem, which will be described by also Zechariah 12 and 14, he'll come down against the Jews of Bozrah or Petra. And it is while that they're in this city that the events of Hosea chapter 5, verse 15 to chapter 6, verse 3 will take place. And that is Israel's national salvation. That's when 2 days of repentance, followed by a third day, when the whole nation as a nation will be saved. So when the whole nation as a nation is saved, then the Messiah will return to rescue his people from the enemy. So when the second coming takes place, the initial place of that second coming won't be the Mount of Olives. It will be here at the city of Bozrah or Petra. The breaker has gone up before them. They have broken forth and passed onto the gate and are gone out thereat. And their king has passed on before them, and Jehovah at the head of them. So here we have the Avenger of blood, and this is the Messiah himself. This is the Messiah coming for them. And the word for Avenger, Redeemer, the word for Redeemer is the kinsman Redeemer, and that's exactly what Jesus is. He's the kinsman Redeemer, because they're in his flesh and blood, they're Jews. Now, the Jewish Messiah is now going to come to save them, and notice here we see this verse gives him 3 titles. He's the breaker, he's king, he's Jehovah. He's called the breaker because he will now lead them out of the city and break against the enemy gathered around the city. The breaker has gone up before them. They have broken forth and passed on to the gate. So you can, if anybody's been there, I've just seen pictures on TV, you can just visualize him walking through that Petra path ahead of his people. And he comes and he attacks the surrounding army. His second title is their king. So this is Israel's king who has returned to them. And that would emphasize his humanity. But then he says this king is Jehovah himself. That's his deity. So the God-man Messiah is coming to rescue the Jews at Bozrah. He gives a progression. He breaks through, he marches on, and he goes out. So the initial place of the second coming will be this city. And you can find this also, reference to this in Isaiah 34, verses 1 to 7, and Isaiah 63, verses 1 to 6, and also Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 3. Now we see the condemnation. We're into the second section now, which is the condemnation and consolation of Israel, which goes from chapter 3, verse 1 to chapter 5, verse 15. We see the condemnation of Israel in chapter 3, 1 to 12. And I said, this is chapter 3, verse 1 to 3. And I said, hear, I pray you, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who pluck off their skin from off them and their flesh from off their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them and break their bones and chop them in pieces as for the pot and as flesh within the cauldron. Now, here we are. This is a condemnation of the rulers. In verses 1 to 4, we have the rulers, and the charge against them comprises the first 3 verses. They're the ones who know what is just. They know what is right. They know the law, but they're the very ones who know the law have now become unlawful. The ones who know what is justice are doing unjust things. The ones who know what is good are the ones who fail to practice good. And a specific charge that he labors against the rulers is that they rob their fellow Jews of all their possessions. Whatever the poor have left, they still take it away from them. It's as if they're skinning God's people. Eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin from off them and break their bones. So they're robbing them of everything. So because of the sin of verses 1 to 3 comes a judgment against the rulers. Then shall they cry unto Jehovah, but he will not answer them. Yea, he will hide his face from them at that time, according as they have wrought evil in their doings. So what we see here is that the judgment of verse 4 is going to be a judgment in kind. Kind for kind. The people cry to the judges for justice, but they fail to get it. And when this judgment hits, the judges now cry to God for help, but will fail to get it. He's going to hide his face from them because they were unjust towards the people. And then we find the condemnation of the prophets in verses 5 to 8 of chapter 3. This is verse 5. Thus says Jehovah concerning the prophets that make my people to err, that bite with their teeth and cry, peace. And whoso putteth not into their mouths, they even prepare war against him. What's he talking about here? As he's moving to condemn the prophets here, this is the false prophets we're talking about here. In verses 5 to 8, he labels a specific charge in verse 5. These are the ones who cause the people to commit error. They're the ones who are leading them astray. Because of their false prophecy, they're leading the people astray. And furthermore, they prophesy if they are fed. And if the people withhold food from them, then they decree a holy war against those who fail to feed them. Wonderful prophets, these guys. So because of this charge and sin against them, in verses 6 to 7 will now come the judgment. Therefore, it shall be night unto you, that you shall have no vision, and it shall be dark unto you, that you shall not divine, and the sun shall go down upon the prophets, and the day shall be black over them. And the seers shall be put to shame, and the diviners confounded. Yes, they shall all cover their lips, for there is no answer of God. So just as the judgment was with the rulers, so it is with the prophets. It will be retribution in kind for kind. The call of the prophet was to save his people out of darkness. That's what he was there for. He was to bring the word of God, the light of God, to the people. Now these prophets are going to find themselves in darkness. And the call of the prophet is to prophesy and tell the people the visions of God, the true prophecies. And if it's a true prophecy, it will come to pass exactly as declared. But the prophecy visions of these false prophets will fail, and that will prove them to be in darkness. So it's going to be night to them because of their false visions. It'll be darkness to them because of the divinings. And the word divining is always used in the Old Testament in a bad sense. So a day will come and they'll cover their lips, which is a sign of shame. And this is going to happen to the false prophets. In verse 8, Micah describes a true prophet, the one who has the Spirit of God, and he's not afraid to declare Israel's sin. But as for me, I am full of power by the Spirit of Jehovah, and of judgment, and of might, to declare unto Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin. So in verse 8, Micah describes a true prophet. He's the one who has the Spirit of God, and he's not afraid to declare Israel's sin. That is it. Contact details there for you to contact if need be. Thank you for coming along.